Hello and welcome to Religion in America. Today we are going to be looking at the first chapter in the Corrigan book, Backgrounds and Beginnings. I'll be adding some of my own commentary and trying to put some things into context. So I'm going to begin by pulling up the PowerPoint presentation here. So, we're going to start by looking at religion in America more broadly, because I'd like to point out that the religious affiliation in the United States, roughly half of the US population identifies with Protestant Christianity. Roughly a quarter comes from Catholic Christianity. 16%, a number that has grown quite a bit in the last few decades, is no religious affiliation, although many of these people who are identified as religious nuns still claim to believe in God or higher power, believe in life after death. They may draw upon different sacred texts. So they're not all atheists. In fact, only a minority of those people are actually what we would call atheists. Mormon, 2%, Judaism, and Islam represent the largest traditions, with smatterings of other communities represented in the United States. The name religio, which means to bind, is a way we try to describe different elements of culture. I would say that religion includes the stories that we tell about who we are, where we come from, how we ought to conduct our lives. They often give people a sense of meaning and purpose. They describe why we should relate to people the way that we do. There are ritual dimensions. Part of the reason that religion is identified as something that binds us together is because a belief in God, for example, the idea that there is a God who is all powerful, all knowing, present everywhere, has an effect that makes people less likely to lie, less likely to cheat, less likely to steal when nobody else is watching, because the idea is that you might still be seen by God. There's nowhere you can hide. And so, given human nature, perhaps this belief in religion could be something that is functional, whether or not it's true, according to many social scientists. We're going to look at how religion is a force that binds people together, but we're also going to look at how religion has been used to justify some of the most infamous, immoral tragedies in human history as well. I talked about the belief in God. That's common in the Abrahamic religions and in many of the Western traditions. We see that religion can also bind people together. Let's say that you believe in reincarnation and that you believe you might literally come back as the person you harm. That might also inspire a sense of ethical obligation. A belief that ultimately we are all one, there's a certain harmony, interconnectedness, and balance, and that only those who are unenlightened would harm others to benefit themselves. These are common ideas in Eastern religious traditions, so they do, both Eastern and Western traditions often serve similar functions. When I say the Western religious traditions, I'd like to focus on the Abrahamic religions, three of the world religions that have been most influential in particularly Western civilization: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, the reason these are called the Abrahamic religions is because the story of Abraham is when the story of Judaism actually begins. According to tradition, Father Abraham lived around the year 1800 before the Common Era. He was a wandering nomad. He and his people had to travel with the seasons, and they saw a community in Canaan that was an agricultural society where they could stay put. And according to tradition, Abraham really wanted children and he wanted his children to someday live in a land like Canaan. Um, the term covenant literally means to cut, and part of the original covenant between God and Abraham is that Abraham promised to circumcise his male descendants, and in return, God promised Abraham that his descendants would be more numerous than the stars and that they would someday own the land of Canaan. Now, this story is told in slightly different ways within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And you're going to see that this is actually a very important story for how European colonists understood who they were and what they were doing in the world. It's related to the notion of the Exodus because, in fact, Abraham's children did not simply march into Canaan and take the land. According to tradition, it took many centuries, and the descendants of Abraham found themselves in Egypt in slavery. And along came a major figure, perhaps the single most significant figure in the story of Judaism, is Moses. And according to tradition, Moses was destined to become a great hero. The Pharaoh had heard about him and killed all the children under 2, but Moses' mother had sent him in a basket of reeds down the Nile River. And ironically, according to the book of Exodus, Pharaoh's opponent, Moses, ended up growing up in the house of Pharaoh. When he was a young man, he felt this strange sense of sympathy for the descendants of Abraham. He saw an Egyptian slave being beaten by his Egyptian master. And the man who gave us the 10 Commandments, Moses, according to the book of Exodus, he killed the slave owner and buried him in the sand. And then he realized what he had done and he hid. He fled out in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, he came across the burning bush. And this bush was none other than God. And this bush told him that he was to lead the people out of slavery into the promised land. And according to tradition, at first Moses resisted, but ultimately he accepted his role. Obviously, historians don't necessarily tell the story the exact same way, but this is a central understanding within Judaism, that God had chosen God's people and that God was going to deliver them out of slavery and bring them to the promised land. Part of the reason we call Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the Abrahamic religions is that they all share some of the same stories and some of their traditions overlap. Jesus was a Jew. His followers identified him as a Jewish Messiah. They looked at the Jewish Bible and interpreted his life in terms of things they had read in that book. His earliest followers remained Jewish, but ultimately, Paul, the second founder of Christianity, became the evangelist of the Gentiles, and he began creating a Gentile Jesus movement, which later became Christianity. After 2 major revolts between the Jews and the Romans by about the year 135 of the Common Era, it became virtually impossible to be a Jew and a Christian. And after that, the 2 traditions moved in separate ways. Christians continue to use the Hebrew Bible, calling it their Old Testament, but they've added their own books that we call the New Testament that include the Gospels and letters of Paul and other letters. Islam also draws upon the stories of creation, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It also tells the stories of Jesus and Mary. Arguably, Islam does to Christianity the same thing that Christianity did to Judaism, say, Old Covenant, New Covenant. Muhammad recited the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, in the early 7th century. And he claims that God had sent numerous messengers to humanity, but because of humanity's hardness of heart, the people distorted the message. The people persecuted the messengers, and as a result, God had to continuously provide new messengers until, according to the Quran, Muhammad is the final messenger. Muslims do not worship Muhammad, they worship only God. In fact, one of their criticisms of Christianity is they said Jesus had been a messenger of God, and instead of following Jesus' message, they argue that followers started to worship him, and so that's part of the reason God had to send another messenger. At the same time, Muslims identify Jews and Christians as people of the book, and the Quran describes a special relationship. It's somewhat contentious, but there's also a recognition of God working in these peoples, in these traditions, in these texts as well. Islam also tells the story of Abraham, but tells the story not so much focusing on Abraham's son Isaac, but focusing on Abraham's son Ishmael. Both Muslims and Jews and Christians, all in some sense, claim to be the rightful heirs to Abraham and to the promises of Abraham. And if you look at the contemporary Middle East, there are some challenges when you have two different groups of people both claiming that God has promised them the same piece of lands. Now, what does that have to do with religion in America? One of the things that I want to point out is the way the concept of manifest destiny ends up playing out in American culture is the idea that Europeans began to see themselves as God's chosen people. The fact that they were militarily and economically superior in their minds at that particular time. Obviously, there were different times when, let's say, Islamic civilizations were more scientific, more tolerant, um, had more advanced economic and military systems. But when we look at the period of European colonial expansion, there was definitely a sense in which Europeans felt that their power had somehow come because they had been selected as God's chosen people. They continued to draw upon the story of the Exodus, and some Europeans felt that they were being persecuted in their own countries, and so God had promised them a new promised land. Just as the original people who conquered Israel had no concern for the Canaanites, many Europeans had little or no concern for the Native Americans. We'll see different models of how different countries related to Europe, to the Native Americans. But notice that for many of these Christians in Europe, there was a sense that they were God's chosen people and the America was God's new Israel, the promised land. Now, Native American religions are talked about briefly in the book, and it's difficult for us to draw too many conclusions because there were, in fact, 2,000 different tribes. The idea we have of Indians on horseback hunting in the plains is really a 19th century image influenced by European culture, horses and guns. One thing the book talks about is the different attitude towards nature that most Native Americans have. And yes, I am encouraging to look at a song that was played in Pocahontas, Colors of the Wind. It was a poem that does, in fact, reflect the idea that every rock, every tree, every river has a spirit. This is known as animism, the idea that everything has spirit nature in it. Notice Judaism, Christianity, and Islam teach that the world is created out of nothing and it will return to nothing. Therefore, it has no intrinsic value. It's simply useful for us. We have dominion over the world. Whereas most Native American traditions, people saw themselves in harmony with nature, in harmony with other living beings. And so it's a different way of looking at the world, but I don't know if that tells us more about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, or if it tells us more about Native American traditions. We will get back to the idea of Native American cultures, but I want to focus on the responses of different European countries. Notice that we could divide the Americas into three large colonial empires. New Spain, and you see how New Spain occupies much of the southwest of what is now the United States, Latin America, much of South America. It's called Latin America, not because anyone there speaks Latin, but because Latin was the official language of the Roman Catholic Church, and Spain was Roman Catholic. If any of you have ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition, you know that in Spain there was an idea that saving people's souls was so important that it would be okay if you made them suffer in the short run. And in fact, many people in Spain wanted to make Spaniards out of people who were Native Americans, and they would have been happy to use an iron fist. But many of the missionaries found, one, that strategy did not work, and two, they had far more empathy for the people living there. And the Spanish colonies are going to be different than, let's say, the British colonies. There's going to be much more intermarrying. There's going to be a syncretism of cultures where certain elements of Native American traditions were drawn in to Catholicism, and certain elements of Catholicism were brought into Native American traditions. You'll see that as the United States continued expanding westward and incorporated certain elements of New Spain, that would have a profound impact on American culture as well. Well, compare that for a moment to New France. By the way, each of these images is somewhat fantastical. Even though New France looks so huge, there actually are only a few settlements throughout here. Many of them focusing along the Great Lakes and coming down the Mississippi. You'll see Detroit, St. Louis, Baton Rouge, New Orleans have strong French connections, and some of that French history is still celebrated in those communities today. And the French were divided between the Catholics and the French Calvinists known as the Huguenots. Much of that land is going to become part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so it represents over 1/4 of the territory in the modern continental United States. I guess one of the main things I want you to see about this chapter on backgrounds and beginnings is that we tend to emphasize the importance of the original 13 colonies, New England's. And they certainly were important. The next chapter is going to focus on them, one of the next chapters. However, if we want to understand America more fully, we need to recognize the influence of the Spanish and French colonies and the influence of multiple cultures on the development of American society. Well, this is an overly brief introduction, but I know you don't want these videos too long. So if you have questions, comments, please email me. Thank you.